All right. Hey there, and welcome to this episode where we're going to talk about how Pure O OCD develops. And so, if that's a new term to you, the idea of Pure O OCD means basically purely obsessional OCD. And really what we're talking about there are kind of a subcategory of OCD that really falls into three themes, right? You have the idea of OCD around harmful or violent thoughts, the OCD around religious themes, and then also OCD around sexuality and relationships, right? And in the Pure O category, what it used to be believed was that OCD was just the obsessive component, right? There was no compulsive component, right? And if, in the last episode, we talked about how OCD develops. So you have the four components, right? You have the obsessive thought or the intrusive thought, and then that produces anxiety or guilt or doubt, right? And then you do the compulsion, and then you get relief. And when those four components kind of lock together, they basically form this loop. And the more you do a compulsion, the more you reinforce the fear. So the worse the fear gets and the worse the compulsion gets, and it just grows, right? And so when we talk about Pure O OCD, it used to be thought that there were no compulsive behaviors and, a person just struggled with the obsessions, right? The obsessive thoughts about, harm thoughts, religious thoughts, or relationships and sexuality. And so they thought, for a long time that it was very difficult to treat. But what we've realized now, right, as there's been advancements in the field and obviously people have gotten better, is that the compulsions that people do are actually usually mental, and they're usually happening just right in their mind. And, if you're not familiar with mental compulsions, we can go into some of the ideas, right? But, the idea of pushing a thought out of your head, right? And thought suppression, right? And what we need to realize is that's actually a behavior, right? And so it's easy to see physical behaviors, right? So in typical, what you might call typical OCD, I don't know that I even really believe in that, to be honest, but with traditional forms of OCD like contamination, you'll see the outward behaviors of washing hands, right? You'll see the outward behaviors of avoiding things that are contaminated, or checking something, or getting, verbal reassurance again and again and again. With pure OCD, or, the forms that kind of fall under that category, right? Like relationship OCD, sexual orientation or pedophilia OCD, harm OCD, self-harm OCD, and then finally scrupulosity, kind of any of the religious or existential forms of OCD. What you'll see is that people do a lot of mental behaviors just right in their head, very like just to themselves, like you would never know, right? So they could be, let's say, in a meeting at work, and they could be analyzing, right? Like, if they had a relationship OCD, they could be analyzing a conversation they had with a coworker and trying to analyze if they were, attracted to the person, right? And because it causes them anxiety, right? So it's very different than the idea of actually being attracted to someone, right? It's this fear that, like, oh my gosh, well, what if I was attracted to them, and was I flirting with them? So they're analyzing and replaying the conversation again and again, and that's all just happening right in their mind. Or they could be, silently praying about something, right? So someone with more scrupulosity and religious form of OCD, which again, we have a whole series on that, and so we'll definitely include that in the notes below the show. But with that particular form of OCD, right, a lot of times people just pray silently in their mind, and it becomes again tough, because part of breaking that cycle is not doing the compulsive behaviors, which means, foregoing prayer. And that's where that conflict comes in, right? With treatment, and, someone will usually say, like, well, my faith is very important to me. And we totally respect that. But when you're using it in a way that's reinforcing a fear that actually is not logical, and it's starting to impact your life to the point where maybe you're not going to work, or maybe your relationships and work is getting damaged, right? That's when we really have to start challenging the difference between, well, what's your faith and what's fear, what's driven by fear and anxiety. And if this behavior of mental prayer, right, can get people, really caught in that loop a lot, where they're praying about the same thing day after day, month after month, year after year, right? In fact, I've seen cases where people have prayed about something for 20 plus years, right? The same thing, and this can go on and on. So things like thought suppression, right? Thought replacement, mental blocking. A big compulsion that people do with pure OCD is cognitive avoidance, meaning that they avoid trying to have a thought or image pop up in their head. And if it does pop up, a lot of kind of blocking techniques. And what we need to realize is these behaviors are exactly the same as if you're doing physical behaviors. So if you're washing or checking, it might be easier for other people to spot it, but all the stuff you're doing in your head, avoiding songs or movies that trigger thoughts, right? Like, these are just examples of little compulsions that develop that pure O OCD. And that's why, I don't even really believe in that concept of pure O OCD, because I've never seen it exist. Like, usually after you talk to someone for just a few minutes, you'll be able to start seeing compulsions that they're doing, and that's why the treatment process is exactly the same. But when we talk about how pure O develops, it really is the same thing, right? You have the intrusive thought, and like I said, with pure O, it's generally in one of those categories, right? With harm or violence, religion or faith, and then sexuality or relationships. And when that thought happens, right, then the person feels anxiety or doubt or uncertainty or whatever that uncomfortable feeling is, and then they engage in a compulsion to neutralize that. And it's just important to realize that with pure O, we really got to look for those mental compulsions, right? And the things you're doing mentally or environmentally, just in your head, right? So you could be checking something mentally. You could be checking to see if you are aroused over a certain situation. Those are examples of mental compulsions, because they just happen right here, and no one's the wiser. And that's the tricky part about pure O OCD, is that while you might see that the person's in distress, you often won't see them doing these things. And so, one of the reasons I wanted to make an episode about this is because just to kind of spread some awareness on this idea of mental compulsions, and how they're the same thing as physical compulsions, because they still keep that loop going. And that's really how that pure O OCD develops, right? It's, you have the thought, the anxiety or uncomfortable sensation, and then the behavior. And the behavior is just usually mental, and that generates relief, and that reinforces the feared thought, which creates a bigger reaction emotionally, and then the loop just grows and grows and grows and grows. And that's how a little thought will turn into something that essentially is controlling a person's life. And so hopefully that was helpful. And again, if you found this helpful, please, we always appreciate if you'd subscribe and like and share. We also have some free resources available for any of you that are struggling with OCD and anxiety. And so down right below, there's a little link where you can click on that, and we can send you those resources to help you as well. And that's over at restoredminds.com. So thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with us today, and we will see you on the next episode. Take care.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you found it helpful, chances are someone else will too, and we'd really appreciate your support by liking and subscribing, and also sharing this video on your social platforms. Also, if you're looking for additional help, we have some resources right down in the links below to help you on your journey. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you soon.